In the book of Romans, we have what is probably the best example of the gospel message that Paul might typically preach. He convincingly shows that justification comes only one way, and that is by God's grace through faith. After a short introduction in chapter 1, he begins to make his case that everyone is guilty before God and that sin is a universal problem for everyone. Beginning in 1:18, Paul speaks of the downward effect that sin has on those who reject God. Today we're going to look at 3 different approaches that people take with understanding who Paul is talking about in Romans 1:18-32. In this passage, Paul speaks of the wrath of God being revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness, against those who, through their unrighteousness, suppress the truth about God. He goes on to say that what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them through his creation. However, instead of allowing creation to point towards God as creator, they turned creation itself into gods and chose to worship them. From there, Paul outlines this downward progression of sin as they devolve into all kinds of behaviors that go against the character and nature of God. The question that we want to look at from this passage today is, who specifically is this that Paul is describing here? As I mentioned, there are 3 main approaches that people take. The first approach I want to look at is also one of the more common approaches to this passage. Like the other approaches that we will talk about, this approach sees Paul building his case in the first 3 chapters that both Gentiles and Jews are under the power of sin. However, unlike the other approaches, this one sees Paul singling out the sinfulness of Gentiles in chapter 1 before he goes on to focus on the sinfulness of Jews in chapter 2, and then summarizing it all up in chapter 3, verses 9 through 20. As the original readers are first century Romans, they wouldn't have to go very far to see Gentiles practicing the very things that Paul is talking about in this passage. In fact, this would have been the life of many of the Roman Gentile Christians only a few short years or months prior to this letter. Paul is saying that they cannot use ignorance as their excuse for their former life because God has made himself known through creation itself. If they had only taken the time to study God's creation, they would have come to a better understanding of the one true God. In fact, there are many people today and throughout history who have just that story. Through their lives, they have shown what Psalm 19 verse 1 says is true. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. The next approach sees Paul talking not about Gentiles, but rather he's referring to Jews in this passage. This approach points out that Paul does not need to make the case to the Roman Christians that Gentiles have a sinful history. No one would know this more than the Gentiles who have recently repented from the lifestyle and decided to follow the God of the Bible. They say that Paul is deliberately making it sound like he is speaking against the Gentiles, but in reality he is showing that the Jewish history is just as sinful and almost indistinguishable from the Gentile history. Paul is doing something similar to what the prophet Nathan did with King David when he got David to pass judgment on himself without even realizing it in his sin with Bathsheba. The giveaway that he is calling out the sinful history of the Jews can be seen in the wording that he uses. He describes their rebelliousness using similar expressions as certain Old Testament authors when they were exposing the sin of Israel. In Romans 1:23, Paul says, "They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." Now let's compare that with what Psalm 106 verse 20 says about Israel's history. They exchanged the glory of God for the image of an ox that eats grass. In Romans 1:24, 26, and 28, Paul repeats that God gave them up. Now compare that with what the prophet Micah says of Israel in Micah 5 verse 3, where he says that God will give them up until the time when the Messiah comes. This approach says that the fact that Israel's history is just as sinful and, in many ways, indistinguishable from Gentile history makes his point that no one group of people is inherently more righteous than another. The third approach sees this passage as speaking not about any one group, but is speaking generally about all humanity. This approach says that this is not specifically about Gentiles and is not specifically about Jews. This is what all humans are like when they reject the truth of God and instead walk in the ways that they think are right. No matter which of the three approaches you take with this passage, they each end up in the same place. As Paul concludes his point beginning in 3 verse 9, are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin, as it is written. None is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. There is nothing that we have done or even could do to make us deserving of God's blessing and favor. None of us is intrinsically any better or more righteous than anyone else. Like Paul, that leaves us with nothing to boast about except, as he says in 15 verse 18, what Christ has accomplished through me.